Welcome to the information webinar on measures J and K. Thank you for your attendance. This webinar is being recorded in both English and Spanish. If you want to listen to today's webinar in Spanish, please follow the instructions on the screen. Attendees today have their video off and their microphones muted, but you will be able to see the speakers and the moderator. Some of you may not be that familiar with the League. We are a nonpartisan organization. We encourage voting and the informed and active participation of all citizens in government. We influence government through education and advocacy. The League does not support or oppose any candidate or political party. The League of Women Voters is celebrating its centennial year. We have been hosting candidate forums and informational seminars for decades. The League is known for providing fair, balanced, and educational programs. We ask attendees to submit their questions by emailing them to the League's email, which is leagueofwomenvoters.sb@gmail.com. Please design your question so that each panelist might be willing to answer it. Please do not send arguments or comments to the email. The panelists won't see them, and the League will not state them. The League reserves the right to edit the questions or combine it with others to eliminate duplicates and in the interest of time. The League is known for its civil discourse. Our moderator today is our program chair, Helen Tran. Let's begin.
Thank you, Betsy, for the introduction. It is good to be here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. As Betsy stated, I'm the League's program chair and moderator for today's webinar on Measure J and K, which are revisions to the county charter. Measure J is placed on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors and is a complete repeal and replace of the county charter. Measure K is a voter initiative which would limit county supervisors to one term and limit their total compensation of $5,000 per month. The League has no position on these measures and is hosting this information panel as part of the League's civic education. Today we have a great lineup of speakers for you. We will have our County Board of Supervisor, Janice Rutherford, representing the 2nd District, speaking in favor of Measure J and opposed to Measure K. Tom Murphy of the Red Brennan Group will be speaking opposing Measure J and in favor of Measure K. Then our League member, John Longville, will speak on the impartial analysis. We will end with questions, if there are any, from our viewers to our speakers. As Betsy stated earlier, and a reminder, please email any questions to leagueofwomenvoters.sb@gmail.com. If you would like to listen to today's webinar in Spanish, please click on the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen to your right. I will now introduce you to our first speaker, County Board of Supervisor, representing the 2nd District, Janice Rutherford. Since being elected in 2010, 2nd District Supervisor Janice Rutherford has led efforts to focus county resources on core public services, balance the need for more jobs with common sense environmental protection, and restore public trust in county government. She served a 2-year term as chair of the Board of Supervisors and was re-elected 2nd District Supervisor in 2014. Janice serves on the board of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, Inland Empire Economic Partnership, and San Bernardino County Employee Retirement Association. She earned a bachelor's degree in political science at UC Riverside before receiving her master's degree in American politics from Claremont Graduate University. Janice lives in Rancho Cucamonga with her husband, Steve Lim, and their 2 boys, Ethan and Noah. They enjoy camping and playing with Legos. Janice is also an avid reader. Let's give a virtual warm welcome applause to County Board of Supervisor Janice Rutherford.
Thank you very much, Helen. I appreciate that introduction. Didn't know you were going to read the whole biography. I'm here today to share some information with you about Measure J, which is a complete revision and rewrite modernization of the county charter. In California, there are a few different ways that counties can be governed. Let's review that counties are created by the state. They're arms of the state, and their function is to carry out state laws and state rules. Counties can either be general law counties, which means they accept all the rules of the state and are governed entirely by state law, or they can create a governing document of their own, which reserves a bit of local control. They're still subject to any state requirements and programs that the state imposes or passes, but they can have some local governance options. About just a few over a dozen counties out of California's 58 counties have chosen to be charter counties, among them most of the largest counties. San Bernardino County has had a charter since 1913. So we have been self-governed in many ways for a long time. But if you'll think about the ways that your business, your way of conducting things has changed since 1913, if you were even around then, you realize that there's a lot of things that are just different, a lot of things that have modernized, and our charter has not kept up with those times. So Measure J is a complete effort to bring us into modern times with the rules and language of the charter, as well as make some changes that we believe are called for by current circumstances. So I'm going to go through those revisions now. I'm happy to answer any questions later or get you additional information. I will tell you that I've been working on the county charter and getting it modernized since right after I was elected to office in 2010. And when I was chair in 2013 and 14, I brought forward revision measures to my colleagues, but we had two brand new members of the board who hadn't really served in government before and didn't know how things were done, much less how they should be done. So we weren't really able to get the momentum to get a complete charter revision on the ballot back then. But in the meantime, we have a board now with a great deal of experience that recognizes that it's time to change things up and improve the way we do business. And in addition to my work, this was brought to a head by the vacancy in the 3rd District Supervisorial seat in 2018. Now, it's not the first time we've had a vacancy. In fact, since 2016, I believe, since 2004, there have been 16 vacancies, either on the Board of Supervisors or in one of our county-wide elected offices like sheriff. So that's 16 times the Board of Supervisors has had to follow the existing charter, which says that a board fills a vacancy by appointment within 30 days. And if the board doesn't act, the governor fills that vacancy. We heard loud and clearly, particularly in 2018, how much the voters of San Bernardino County wanted to have a special election called to fill the vacancy. It is right now against the law. We are required for the board to make the appointment within a month, and if not, the governor makes the appointment. So the biggest overall change to the charter in Measure J is adding the provision that the Board of Supervisors could choose to hold a special election. We could have a special election, we could fill by appointment. If we neglect to do that, let's say there's a vacancy on the Board of Supervisors and you have a 2-2 split on the supervisors about who should be appointed. If we're not able to resolve that within 60 days, then a special election is automatically called. We think that this preserves the rights of our voters and makes our system much more fair and locally controlled here in San Bernardino County. So that was the impetus for this. Measure J, but there is a whole bunch more included in Measure J that I'd like to walk through with you. I'd first like you to think about 1913 and the fact that was before women had the right to vote. And so our charter is full of only male pronouns and never considers that there might be a female on the board, much less serving as chair of the board. So we'd like to do an overall change that just updates all the pronouns, as well as fixing some of the real archaic language. Back in 1913, a chairman of the Board of Supervisors had to personally sign every document that came out of the county officially. And so the charter requires that the board chair be in his office adjacent to the board chambers during all working hours. Doesn't make sense in 2020. We have professional staff who file most of the documents, and our chair is able to work really from anywhere in the world, given the electronic communications like we're enjoying today. We have language in there, for example, that says board meetings and special meetings have to be noticed by telegram. I don't even know if most people know what a telegram is anymore. So we like to update that language and allow for electronic posting of information and modern communications. We'd also like to get rid of the pages and pages of language included in the charter that deal with budget, finance, and court operations that the state no longer requires of counties. The language is null and void, but it still takes up pages in our current charter. We'd like to clean that up. We also think another change that needs to be made is moving the swearing in date for supervisors. Right now, we are one of, I think, only 2 counties that does the swearing in of supervisors in December. And I don't know why that originally was put into the charter. Our other countywide elected offices are sworn in January, as is the legislature. The problem with this in current times is that we all recognize, we're not happy about it, but we recognize that elections no longer happen in one day. We don't have election results on election night. We don't have them the next day, and frankly, we're probably not even going to have them the next week. State law requires counties to certify an election within or 30 days after the election is held. And yet, by a quirk of the calendar, we swear in new supervisors within 30 days of the election, meaning we could be required by our charter to swear in a new supervisor before the election is certified and votes are final. By moving the swearing in date to January with our other offices, we would avoid this awkwardness. We'd also like to tighten up what I call the term limit loophole. Back in 2006, when voters of San Bernardino County adopted term limits, they did so with language that says supervisors can serve for no more than 3 consecutive terms. That word consecutive allows for some gaming of the system. It means, for example, that if I hired a chief of staff who was also politically connected and inclined and lived in the district, maybe we would just take turns running for supervisor and being each other's chief of staff. Neither of us would be subject to the term limits then because our terms were not consecutive. I don't think that's what voters intended, and I don't think that's in anyone's best interest. So this language in Measure J removes the word consecutive and simply creates a 3-term limit. That's consistent with many other counties. Some have 2. We weren't able to find any that have the 1-term limit proposed in Measure K. At the same time of updating term limits, it also clarifies the language in the charter that deals with the salaries of the Board of Supervisors. Right now, our salaries are set by doing a survey of 3 similar local counties, Riverside, Orange County, and San Diego County. Those are similar budgets and populations and responsibilities. But all 3 of those counties now peg their pay to the pay of a state superior court judge. So rather than the supervisors themselves having control over what the pay is, they picked an impartial state measure and pegged their pay to that. Orange and Riverside counties do 80% of a judge. San Diego does 90% of a judge. Right now, our charter requires that staff survey those 3 counties, do the calculations, and pay us the average of those 3 salaries. Well, it doesn't make sense for us to have that extra step in there since all 3 of those are now pegged to the state judge system. So we're proposing that we join Riverside and Orange County in tying our pay to 80% of a superior court judge salary. But we go one step farther than those counties and indeed other charters in the state by requiring that any increase to that salary, any increase that the board wants to take, has to be done by board members in an open public hearing so that the community can weigh in on whether those raises are timely, deserved, and affordable. There are some other things that Measure J does that we think are improvements to the charter. Creates or requires that the board establish a redistricting commission so that instead of us drawing our own district lines, we have a commission of residents of the county who are involved in that process. It requires that the board oversee the existence of an emergency stockpile that would serve us well, whether it were a pandemic or an earthquake or other natural disaster that afflicts us in the future. It requires that any general public health order issued by a public health officer be explained to the Board of Supervisors and the public at an open, agendized, noticed public meeting within 30 days of the order. There's nothing in Measure J that changes the lines of responsibility or authority for either the board or the public health officer. Those are still governed by state law. But it does require that that public health officer appear in public, explain their order, and take questions from the Board of Supervisors and the public as they relay them through the board. Measure J requires that the Board of Supervisors establish rules of order for their meetings. Right now, those aren't required. Right now, it's rule by the chair. Whoever holds the gavel makes the rules. It's tended to work okay for the 5 of us serving on the board, but I don't believe that it's served the public well. When you sit in our audience or log in online and want to understand how our meeting is going to be conducted, how motions are made, how the rights of the minority are protected, you have no way of knowing that because it is at the whim of whoever yields the gavel. So we require each board to establish rules of order that can be printed, that can be put online, so that any member of the public knows what those rules are and can see that their elected officials are abiding by them. The charter also requires that the board establish campaign contribution limits. Doesn't set what that number is. Again, we don't want to get years and years out of date, but it requires that the board have an ordinance with campaign contribution limits. The board can change that figure as is prudent and as the public recommends to them in those public hearings. We also have a provision that the board deal with lobbyist transparency. In some counties, this is manifested as a registration requirement. In some cases, it includes prohibitions on their behaviors. Again, we don't want to get locked into what that might look like or define a lobbyist, since in those details, there can be a lot of mischief. However, the charter requires that those details be worked out in a public meeting, public hearings, where the public input would be allowed and the board would be able to arrive at a lobbyist transparency system that would serve everyone. And finally, this charter requires that there be a regular, at least once a decade, review of the whole charter by members of the public. I'm hoping that that means we won't get more than a century out of date as we are right now. And if there are other changes in state law that would require the charter be updated, that we will be able to take that action sooner rather than later. That's Measure J. That's why it's on the ballot right now. That's why we're asking the public to support those changes, improvements, and modifications in the county charter. Now, Measure K only deals with 2 of the topics that I mentioned, board term limits and salaries. I spoke to Measure K being the only single term limit that we could find. I will simply say that as someone now in my 10th year in office, that those first 4 years, that first term, roller coaster. Absolutely drinking from a fire hose and trying to figure out the law and the players, learn the bureaucracy, integrate with what the state requires, and serve on all the other boards and commissions. And what you have to understand is the job of a county supervisor isn't just going to 2 Board of Supervisors meeting once a month. It also involves overseeing the entire county government, which is more than 20,000 employees and a budget of about $6 billion right now. It also requires board members to sit on about 55 other boards and commissions required by state or other laws, and all the subcommittees on those organizations as well. There's a lot to read, a lot of policy issues to dissect and understand before you ever show up to a meeting. And then we each have between 400 and 420 thousand constituents who expect us to be available to help solve their problems and answer their questions pretty much 24/7. This is not a small part-time job. You can't learn how to do it well in 4 years, and you won't be ready on day 1 to do the job. I would also note that a salary of only $5,000 a month is inadequate for a job of this scope and size. Indeed, if Measure K passed, San Bernardino County, the largest county in the United States, the 5th largest by population in California, the governing body would receive the same pay as do the supervisors in Butte County, which has about 229,000 residents. The job of a supervisor in Butte County is nowhere near what a job of a supervisor in San Bernardino County is. And I would suggest that our job is nowhere near what that of a supervisor in Los Angeles County is. That's more akin to running a small country. But supervisors are elected officials who do a more than full-time job, represent hundreds of thousands of people, and deserve to be paid fairly. We believe that Measure K is not a fair salary, and that by pegging our pay to that of judge in the state of California, 80% of a judge's pay, that that's fair, it's transparent, and it's reasonable for the kind of work that is expected. So I'm asking for voters to approve the new charter with all the reforms in Measure J and vote against Measure K's unreasonable restrictions. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Supervisor Rutherford. I will now introduce you to our next speaker, Tom Murphy of the Red Brenna Group. After 23 years as a military helicopter pilot, Tom Murphy moved on to a career in project management. Currently, he operates EPM Services, a project management company, while serving as president of the Red Brenna Group, a nonprofit dedicated to big-hearted communities and small government. Mr. Murphy holds a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology from Long Beach State University, along with a Master's in Business Administration from San Diego State. Mr. Murphy grew up in Whittier, California. He and Tambra have 4 adult children, a grandson, and Axel, and a German Shepherd that is currently begging to go for a walk. Let's give a virtual warm welcome applause to Tom Murphy.
Thank you, Helen. I appreciate the introduction and particularly appreciate the invitation to speak to the League of Women Voters. Give me just a second to share my screen here and let you at least look at a presentation rather than at my full face there. What I'd like to do today is essentially present to you the case to vote no on Measure J and vote yes on Measure K, and I'll cover them in those orders, in that order. Before I do that, though, I'd like to give you a little bit of background and so that you folks can understand our thinking, or what our organizational goals are and why we do what we do. And our tagline or our mission statement, whatever you want to call it, is we support big-hearted communities and small government. Today, what we're going to talk about is all on the small government side of the ledger. So how do you do that? How do you go about engendering or facilitating small government? Essentially, we have 2 simple strategies at the moment. One is to work to change the incentive for elected officials to serve. And on this go around, that's Measure K, because we're trying to change the incentives. Our other strategy is to reduce government's access to resources. We incorporated in 2017. This is another way to say that is we're asking government really to live within their means. And you see that from our presentation on Measure U last week, I believe it was. So let's kind of step into this. And I'm going to go through a couple slides that are essentially problem statements. And it's a problem that there is uncontrolled growth of the county government. And most of the numbers that you see below are going to be baselined in 2010. And that was when a non-elected CEO was appointed and delegated a substantial amount of responsibility in terms of county operations. Since then, there's been a 2.6 billion budget increase. There's been a near 23% increase in headcount, which is, if you kind of math that out, it's 3 times the rate of the growth of population in the county. 2010, the county had 1 employee for every 108 citizens. And if you roll that forward 10 years now, we have 1 employee per every, I believe it's 92, my screen's covered. If I got that number wrong, forgive me. But so, and just by comparison, Orange County has 1 employee for every 168 citizens. The point there is, if you believe in small government, the trends are not promising. We contend that the fiscal house really is in disarray. we're spending 6.9 billion for what was done for 2.4 billion in 2010. According to Stanford economist, pensiontracker.com, if you use market rate of return, the pension system is $11.8 billion in market debt, and this is a 2018 figure, and it's funded at 46%. And obviously, the strategy to catch up there is that pension fund is going to have to take higher and higher risks. There's also over $500 million in pension obligation bonds on the county's books. And using Measure U, that begins to kind of drive what I consider somewhat, not desperate, but what we believe are illegal moves, and that is you impose illegal taxes on folks throughout the county without their vote, rather than reprogram 3.7% of the discretionary budget. And then for more performance measures, the general idea here is that, I think we would all agree that there's a base role that government provide stability. And the performance trends, again, particularly in that area, are not encouraging. Last, what we contend that the way the county is structured, particularly the elected and at the senior bureaucrat level, is that we're creating really a ruling class versus a working class. Elected supervisors earn $240,000, just north of $245,000 per year in total compensation. That's much more than the average workaday person at county. It's if you look across at county supervisors or their analogies across the country, it's 58,000 nationally. If you look at a private industry, it's roughly 40K for a yearly earnings. If you look at full-time government worker, it's 54% more at 61,500. So our concern is that, particularly in San Bernardino County, being one of the poorest in the state, that like I said, we're creating a ruling class versus a working class. Okay, there's some history behind Measure K. So as I mentioned, 2010 Board of Supervisors hired the non-elected CEO. And in 2012, Red Brennan, who's not with us anymore, passed away. He signed off on an initiative that eventually became Measure R. And what it did was there's been changes over the years, but essentially it did the same thing. It reduced supervisory salary, term limits, and that was put on the ballot. Got, I think, 70,000 signatures to put that on the ballot. And that passed by, I think it was 64% of the vote. Measure Q was also on the ballot, also placed on the ballot by the vote of 5 supervisors. Long story short, Measure Q passed with 67% of the vote. So because it got the higher number of votes, it was controlling. I tell you that story because I would like to really point forward that from our perspective, J and K, this is a repeat. J is on the ballot because the supervisors have chosen really to repeat the 2012 history. In 2018, we began to submit a modified initiative. It was the county sued the proponent. It got held up in court, so we were unable to meet our deadlines on that one. And then 2020, we gathered 75,000 signatures from county voters and put it on the ballot. In response, the supervisors now put Measure J and termed it charter reform put on the ballot. So I'm moving on now, I guess, to know on Measure J and why. Is this really charter reform, or is this really protecting the ruling class self-interest? And what I would really encourage constituents of the League of Women Voters is to, as our founding fathers did, to approach government with a skeptical eye and to read through the new charter. And I'll talk about that some more, but we contend that Measure J simply consolidates and expands power of elected supervisors and senior bureaucrats of the county. If you read it carefully, it exempts all supervisors that will be sitting as of the 1st of December or the 7th of December, I think it is. It exempts them from the clauses in their new charter for both pay and term limits. At the end of the day, an elected supervisor can still serve 12 long years. And we believe that that the county really has pushed to kind of hide this reach for expanded powers, et cetera, behind some of the things that they are marketing, such as the reduction of term limits, removing gender names, pandemic protocols. So when I talked earlier about reading through the draft charter and asking themselves why, I'm not going to go all through the way through the charter. I really encourage folks to do that. There's a section at the bottom of this presentation that kind of, we had an attorney read through it and point some things out. But ask yourself, why? Why are they updating the charter now? Ask yourself why sections 101 and 102 are even there. They're not in the old charter. Why is section 206 really, really careful to point out the need for a full-time supervisor? As a supervisor mentioned, section 208 sets base salary equal to 80% of Superior Court judge. Is that a pay cut or is it a pay raise? Again, why is there a clause at the end of section 204 that excludes all 5 supervisors that'll be seated in December? And then why is there a clause at the end of 288? Again, it's a term limit and a salary exclusion from that charter they're proposing. And then the current charter never mentions the CEO. And then why is the proposed charter codify what's a $500,000 a year position? We really believe that there are, if you read that charter carefully, that it will raise a lot of questions carefully and skeptically. And you'll ask yourself, why is there a rush? What's the rush to suddenly update this charter after, since 1917, was it, I believe? And to ask yourself, what's the ruling class worried about? And the simple answer is that they're worried about the threat from Measure K. So to move on to Measure K and our pitch, if you will, that voters will consider voting yes on Measure K. The problem statement, 3 terms will net a county supervisor in total compensation in excess of $3 million. They walk away with a lifetime pension, medical benefits, and this just creates a very powerful incentive to reach those re-election, to be re-elected. And in so doing, it creates a conflict of interest for elected supervisors. We believe that Measure K removes that conflict of interest. The results of the conflict of interest are that compensation and pensions, as we addressed earlier, far outpace the private sector. Public unions will power far beyond what is reasonable, and that's no secret at the county level, at the state level. Pensions are consuming not only the county finances, but important to us it is burdening future generations. I use the term ruling and working class specifically because of that clause. The debt we are incurring now through for the pension system is going to be on the shoulders of our future generations. Services are disappearing, and fees, taxes, and fines are increasing. So if you look at the last 10 years since we went to the CEO model, we contend that the supervisors have, if you will, taken their hand off the reins of government. And as a result, the bureaucracy, the system has let me step back. A lot of times as you go through this, people begin to point fingers at personalities. Like, this person is bad, this person is wicked. I do not contend that at all. I believe that what we have is a system that is run amok. It's not people, it's not personalities, it's a system that's run amok. And it's us as voters concerned about our county that need to move to rein that system in and to begin to control it rather than have it control us. So what do we propose to do that? Remember way back in the beginning, we talked about changing incentives. We believe that if you set annual compensation for elected representative on par with the median household income in the family or in the county, which is about $60,000, then we've changed the incentive for someone to want to be elected and serve. If we set a term limit at 1 4-year term, that removes that pressure, if you will, from that system that we need to gain control and keep from running amok. There's not that pressure to be reelected, so that elected representative can execute on their agenda, do their 4 years, and then back to their day job. And essentially, I just talked through that slide, and that really is my message to the League of Women Voters, that we feel like J is a rush job, and that there's a reason why it's a rush job. And the reason is that it was drafted by the county with a specific agenda to increase the power of the bureaucracy and protect the ruling class. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tom. I will now introduce you to our impartial analysis speaker, League member John Longville. John currently serves on the Board of Trustees with the San Bernardino Community College District since 2008, at which time he retired from his adjunct faculty position at San Bernardino Valley College. He also is a member of the Board of Directors of the San Bernardino Valley Water Conservation District and has previously served as a member of the California State Assembly, Mayor of Rialto, and member of the Rialto City Council. John Longville has been active in a wide array of local civic and charitable organizations since he first moved to San Bernardino County in 1972 to work as a press secretary for the late Congressman George Brown. Let's give a virtual warm welcome applause to our League member, John Longville.
Thank you very much, Helen. The discussion of measures J and K, excuse me, can't be separated entirely from the discussion of measure U. They've all been mixed together, and the financial donations are heavily linked in in who is paying for what. This is a very complicated set of measures, and you have measure J, which is, it had to be technically filed in advance of K at the final step in order to get the letter J, whereas the other one got K. But even though K was the effort to create it began before J. But if measure J is adopted, we're talking about a large number of changes in county government, many of them significant, some of them almost cosmetic, but a variety of updating things. And included within it are provisions related to the Board of Supervisors term limits and the Board of Supervisors compensation. Measure K addresses only those two issues. So in the event that both measures J and K passed, measure K would be controlling for the provisions related to the Board of Supervisors compensation and term limits, whereas measure J would be adopted in all other respects. And that would be kind of from if I were sitting on the Board of Supervisors, that'd be almost one of the worst things imaginable, because the truth is that that it is a very draconian kind of cut, whether you favor it or oppose it. So the funding for these have been coming from a large number of sources. The early funding was primarily, let's see, on more on yes on measure J. A lot of early funding, but it's been filled in, and again, it's hard to separate. As you look at the campaign finance reports, committees are donating to one another, and committees are performing work on behalf of multiple campaigns. So it's real hard to track it. But we're talking about somewhere less than $100,000 in all on behalf of the stuff that I've seen thus far on behalf of measure J, less than that on behalf of measure K, although the financing is hard to track. And I want to stress here, because this is real important to note, that politics is the art of compromise, and there are good provisions from almost anyone's perspective and bad provisions in almost any compromise that develops. That's just the way it works. And the same thing happens with regard to the financing of these measures. There are interests who would prefer to see some of these changes take place, and those who would prefer not to see them take place. And Measure U plays into this significantly in terms of the funding. So the only thing I can urge people to do is to actually read the text of what these things do and take a look at who's supporting them. There's significant financing has been put in, but not the kind of funding that you sometimes see. It's very significant funding, scores of thousands of dollars on both of these two measures. That's it.
Thank you, John. Before we go open up to questions, so far we have one question. Want to give an opportunity for any rebuttal. Supervisor Rutherford, would you like to respond to Tom Murphy's presentation?
Sure, thanks. I have a couple comments. First, let me start by saying I love your slogan. Big hearts in small governments is absolutely perfect. And I think most of the members of the Board of Supervisors, in fact, all of us, would agree with that. The challenge of county government in California is that our size is not dictated by the five of us. Our size is dictated by our population, how much social services and health care they need, and how much the state and federal governments require of us to provide in terms of those social and health care services. The size of our budget is also dictated by the fact that we have 20,000 square miles to cover and more than 2 million residents to serve. That's larger, more space. And you say, what does that have to do with it? Think of the miles of road that have to be maintained. Well, those are county public works employees and special districts employees who do that road maintenance. It is the state and federal government that set up the formulas for how much social benefits people receive. You can object to those, you have every right to object to those, but your advocacy about whether those programs should or should not exist is correctly placed at the state and federal level. All we do is administer those programs. We try to do it in the most effective way possible with the goal of moving people to self-sufficiency. That's a local goal. But nonetheless, there are formulas that determine how many staff we have and how much money we spend on those programs. There was specifically a little bit of misinformation that I'd like to correct. He cited our pension funding at 46%. I'd like to point out that the pension is handled by San Bernardino County Employees Retirement Association, a separate entity from the county. It involves the pension money not just of county employees, but about 15 other local agencies and districts, and that we are at the 80% funded level with a very low risk, low volatility portfolio at this time. The pension obligation bonds that he mentioned were issued long before I even came into the office. We are on schedule to repay them just fine. He said our total supervisorial compensation is $245,000 per year, but that's inaccurate. The current charter has very clear language that our total compensation is limited to the survey of those 3 counties I mentioned. It is currently cannot go over $200,000 a year for any of the 5 of us. As for whether the change is a cut or an increase, it is a slight salary reduction. It's not significant. If you think about it, right now our salaries are determined 80% Orange, 80% Riverside, 90% San Diego. They take those percentages are of a Superior Court judge's pay. So if you average 80%, 80%, and 90%, and then we just go to the straight 80%, you can see that it's going to be a slight reduction. It's a couple $100 a year. It's not significant. As I said before, I think our salaries are fair and reasonable for the number of people we serve and for the workload that we have. In terms of, he seemed to argue several times that we're exempting ourselves from the term limits and the salary changes. And I just want to point out, it's state law that says that you can't lower an elected official's salary while they're serving into the term, and that the rules that applied both term limit and salary wise when the person filed for the office are the rules that apply for the length of their term. So any changes, either J or K, will apply when the next round of supervisors is elected and sworn in. So it doesn't apply to myself or the 4th District Supervisor because we're halfway through our terms. It won't apply to the newly elected supervisors in Districts 1, 3, or 5 because when they filed for office earlier this year, the current charter prevailed. So the next supervisors elected in the 2nd and 4th District in 2022, whatever new rules are in place, either J or K, will apply to them. That's not mischief on our part, that's how state law does it. He said the new charter removes ethics requirement. It does no such thing. If you look in section 6, it actually is very clear that there is a requirement for ethics training for all elected officials. He talked about this being a rush to get this to the ballot. As I mentioned, I've been working on it since 2012. My colleagues got on board with it in 2018. The chairman appointed a subcommittee to work on the language starting in 2019. We'd hoped to have a lot of public hearings and engagement this year. COVID stole that from us, but state law says you can only put charter on a general election, so we had to get it on the November ballot. It has nothing to do with K. As John Longville alluded to, both J and K can pass. They both need 50% plus 1 to pass. If Measure K and Measure J pass that threshold, and Measure K gets 1 more vote than J, then the term limit and salary provisions from K are the brand new first amendments to our new charter in J that was passed. So you can get all the changes that I talked about and still have the one term limit and the low salary that Kay asks. Both of those things can happen. If both pass, but J gets one more vote than K, then K's provisions fall away and all of J in the new charter take effect. And of course, the Red Brennan Group or any other group can come forward with amendments to the charter at any time. And I would suspect, based on their diligence and how many requests they file, that they'll be back in 2 and 4 years with additional changes. In terms of supervisors taking their hands off the reins of government, the switch from chief administrative officer to chief executive officer happened before I got elected. But I will tell you that I don't know of any other organization that has a client base, or sorry, an employee base of over 20,000 people and a budget of $6 billion that isn't run by a professional executive. CEOs exist in government and the private sector. They run the organization on a daily basis. The Board of Supervisors is there to oversee not just the CEO, but all of the employees of the county, as well as to serve and respond to our constituents. That is a more than full-time job. That's why the new charter makes that explicit. And again, you can disagree with that. You can wish we were a part-time job. You could wish we didn't have 55 other commissions that we're required to serve on. But that's the way it is in California right now. If you want to live in a smaller county with a smaller budget, I'm sure Butte County would be happy to have you. If you want to have a different size government, you might want to check out any of the other 3,000 plus counties in the United States that are tiny. When he talks about the average salary being $58,000, well, counties range in size from the 10 million residents of Los Angeles County to a county in Hawaii that has only 86 people in it. So an average salary is not really a reasonable comparison. That's why we think the provisions of Measure J, or the current charter that look at comparable counties that are nearby us, or the provisions of Measure J that tag it to a state judge's pay, are very reasonable. And I just want you to think about incentives for a moment, the incentive to serve in public office. You know, whether the pay is $60,000 a year or the $171,000 that it would be under the Measure J provisions, serving in public office is a very, very difficult thing. It's also incredibly rewarding. You get the opportunity to help people, to serve your community, to shape policy, to make changes. You take a lot of beating up on, you make a lot of sacrifices. None of that changes. None of that changes to what your salary is. But when you talk about who you're beholden to when you're serving, I'd like you to think about who's going to be able to take this more than full-time job that requires an incredible amount of travel, an incredible amount of study. Who's going to take that for $5,000 a month? Probably only someone who has a source of income from somewhere else, either from another job, which frankly, I don't know how they would get the time to do if they're doing this job, or a promise of income after they get out. When you talk about the influence of public employee unions, of bureaucracies, of lobbyists, of special interests, all of those things would actually be magnified and made worse if you have elected officials who have no chance of accountability to the voters because they never stand for re-election, and no opportunity to earn the fair income for the full-time plus work provided. This absolutely turns the incentives on the head, but in the opposite way that Mr. Murphy is arguing. So again, I ask you for a complete revision of the county charter that addresses not just term limits in pay, but recognizes the existence of female elected officials, correctly brings us into conformance with state requirements, and requires that we have a redistricting commission, a charter review commission, ethics training, limits on lobbyist involvement, and a whole host of other benefits that I invite you to read for yourself. Thank you for your time today, and to the League of Women Voters for hosting this forum.
Thank you, Supervisor Rutherford. Tom, would you like to add anything?
Let me, a couple things, and I'll definitely try to be quick. First of all, we did bring in Measure U, And I would acknowledge that Supervisor Rutherford in general has been on the right side of that boat, although it was unsuccessful, and we appreciate that. Um, the in, in terms of, if you will, kind of a rebuttal, you know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So in terms of the size of government, particularly for an organization that's driven by a small government ethic, there just needs to be a different approach. And there is nothing in J that is indicative that this is a substantially different approach to the problem of a government bureaucracy, if you will, that's out of control. And that's it. That's kind of where I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you, Tom. We actually did have one question. It was regarding lowering will lowering the pay to $60,000 annually, as proposed to Measure K, result in only wealthy people or retired pensioners running for office? And I believe Supervisor Rutherford, you did answer. But anything to add to that, Tom or Supervisor?
Supervisor Rutherford, you have the floor first.
I'll simply reemphasize, $5,000 a month is not adequate pay for what this job requires. And I don't believe that even the most public-minded person is going to be inspired to take on the challenges of this job and the sacrifices of public service for that amount of money. They're going to need additional income or the promise of additional income, which renders them subject to conflicts that are not preferable. That's all.
My response to that would simply be to remind folks that are watching this that we have set that compensation on par or equal to the median household income in the county. That's what households out there are bringing in. So I guess to claim that the governing ethic is due almost 3.5, 4 times more, or excuse me, the government function is worth more than 3.5 to 4 times that number. We simply disagree with. We also believe, to the question, that certainly folks that have other income would serve. I don't think that's unusual right now with the folks that are on the Board of Supervisors. But it would also, you know, remembering that that median household income is $5,000 a month. You know, somebody that is work-a-day, grinding away, they say, hey, I have something that I want to do at county government. I'm going to go do that for 4 years. And it's not really going to affect my salary level, because that's what I'm making now. And then when I'm done, I can go back to it. So I contend that the salary level is not going to exclude anybody in the county.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Supervisor Rutherford. That's all the questions that we had received. We want to thank you to all of the speakers for your participation, as it is important to help educate voters to make informed decisions on Measure J and Measure K, which are revisions to the county charter. It should be noted that the opinions and statements of the speakers are not a reflection of the League's opinion or position. The League of Women Voters presents the pros and cons in a nonpartisan, impartial manner. I will now turn it over to our League President, Betsy Starbuck, to provide closing remarks. Betsy, you're on mute.
let me start over. Thank you, Helen, for being our moderator today. Also, thanks to County Supervisor Janice Rutherford, Tom Murphy of the Red Brennan Group, John Longville, our Spanish interpreter, Mariela Trujillo, our league technical support team of Scott Starbuck and Stephanie McLean. We appreciate your time and contributions, and thank you to the attendees for taking time to become more aware of a local ballot measure. We remind everyone that Election Day is November 3rd, but election season begins October 5th when the Registrar of Voters mails ballot to all registered voters. There are many options for voting that ballot. You can discover your options by accessing the County Registrar of Voters website at www.sbcountyelections.com. There's no reason not to vote. If you want to check your status as a registered voter, go to www.voterstatus.sos.ca.gov. Many times it's difficult for voters to find information about candidates that are lower on the ballot. The League offers a free service where all candidates can post information about themselves and their positions. It is called Voter's Edge, and if you are uncertain about a candidate, want to find out a bit more or see who's supporting them, check out votersedge.org. Finally, we're a membership organization made stronger by the diversity of people who join. This tape and ability to join the League of Women Voters is all available on the League's website. Thank you very much for your attendance today.